And for the first time, we have an explicit episode coming up here, so please put on your headset, ask your children to leave the room, and if you're sensitive to language, skip this one.
Hi, I'm audio description writer Justin Soule, and you're listening to the Audio Description Narrators of America Know Your Narrator series, Beyond Your Narrator episode.
Welcome to the ADNA Audio Description Network Alliance Know Your Narrator series. Today, we're very happy to have Jordan Cole and Ashley Bushner with us from Site Attendant, the acclaimed Site Attendant podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having us.
We're very excited.
Yeah, thrilled.
Hey, Jordan, what do you love about audio description?
Oh, honestly, everything. Access is the main word that comes to mind. Just being able to sit down and throw on whatever movie or show I want and actually understand what's going on. Yeah, it's just opened everything up. I mean, and it's the case that there's so many shows that I would love to watch that are on the list of waiting, but there's an incredible amount of content out there, enough that I'll never make it through all of it.
Very cool. What about your experience, Ashley?
So 2 things come to mind from me. I am definitely newer to the audio description game, but I really enjoy the parts of the films and the television shows that I would otherwise miss. So I don't know, to give us kind of some context. So I am sighted and Jordan is blind. So when we watch things with audio description, I'm getting the visual piece of it, but I'm also listening to the audio description. So I'm getting parts of it that I would have otherwise completely missed, or getting some extra information that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And then honestly, just to kind of piggyback on to what Jordan said, is the access is it's definitely become much more important to me, and getting to just talk about it and introduce it to people is really exciting. We have several people who listen to the show who have said, wow, I've never thought about this before. I've never thought about what access looks like for people who are blind. Because when you talk about accessibility, oftentimes you think about sign language interpreters and wheelchair accessibility and things like that. So I've had fans who have contacted us and said, hey, we threw audio description on to watch, The Mandalorian or something like that. And it is so descriptive, and the way that they say things and they delivered the coup de grace and, et cetera, those kinds of things. They're I wasn't sure what kind of language to expect, but it is very descriptive, and I enjoy it. And I'll have it on even when Jordan's not around. I'll put it on anything that has audio description. It doesn't matter if it's what is that called? The Great Big Flower Fight or whatever on Netflix, and anything. A reality TV show, or anything, I'll just throw it on. And sometimes it just kind of fades into the background, and then I'll hear something and I'll just be oh wow, that's a really interesting take on that. Or we've noticed in one movie previously, the audio description told us who the bad guy was and who the good guy was, and we thought that was really interesting too. So just the language that they use is really great.
Yeah,
very cool. It sounds like that curb effect helps both with the access part for Jordan, and also for you, Ashley, to be able to, as a sighted person, experience something a little more or a little differently.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. And speaking of language, let's put out the disclaimer for our audiences that if there's any children around, put your headset on or send them out of the room, because there's likely going to be swearing in this episode, which is very exciting.
We keep it aggressive at the Site Attendant podcast.
We sure do.
Well, what is it about that aggressiveness of Site Attendant? What is it that got you to Nick Cage and audio description and swearing?
Well, okay. So the origins of this podcast, we always just joked about starting a podcast, and we joked about how maybe we should just go for it and start a podcast about Nick Cage or someone similar, like a Steven Seagal or something like that, where it's just not, there was never advocacy that came up about it. It was always just a joke about, let's have a podcast about some action star, right? Mm-hmm. And then it became, what if we would go through these Cage movies, because we noticed almost none of the Cage movies that were available on Amazon or Hulu or any of the streaming services had audio description. So we were going to originally call the podcast Blind Cage Match. Mm-hmm. And
oh, come on, that's brilliant.
It's a great name. Yeah. And that's what we, but once we decided that we would eventually step past the Nick Cage stuff, we didn't kind of want to pigeonhole it and leave ourselves stuck with explaining the origins of the name when we're at episode 210 or whatever it might be. So that kind of moved us towards the idea of movies without audio description, what that experience looks like for someone who's blind. And in a lot of cases you can get most of the movie, at least I can, with stuff that's very like dialogue based. But with a lot of action movies, you're left wondering what's going on. And so when Ashley and I would watch movies together, she would occasionally just say, yeah, that guy just kicked that guy off the boat, or whatever it might be. And then we just decided, let's make a podcast out of that. So we kind of bounce between movies that have audio description, movies that don't.
And some films that you had seen previously. So another part of this was that Jordan has this habit of asking me several times, like, have you seen this movie? Have you seen this movie? Have you seen this movie?
Well, I just forget your answer.
I know. Yeah. And it was always Gone in 60 Seconds. Over and over again. It was, have you seen Gone in 60 Seconds? No. We should watch it. Okay, we'll get there. Like, we're this is in like the first few months of our relationship, and we also had the luxury of starting our relationship right like a couple months before COVID happened.
Shortly before.
So boy, we had a ton of time,
plenty of time to
watch some movies. And I love the Fast and the Furious movies, and I hope that we do them in the future. That's another little behind the scenes in the future. Hopefully we can do those.
Yeah, we're looking forward
so
to
like
that.
Car films, like I'm totally into, and Angelina Jolie and her terrible hair in that film. That film has not aged well, but it's very entertaining. And when we finally got around to watching Gone in 60 Seconds, I highly enjoyed it. But it was definitely one that like Jordan had seen before. And there's a big mixture of films that we had both seen before, like the National Treasures and that kind of stuff. But then a bunch that we just hadn't. And we found out that like not only is Nick Cage just one of the most eccentric human beings in all of history, but he is just like, he's constantly working. Like he has, at the time when we were talking about the podcast, he had 104 movies done. And that was that was last July.
Yeah.
So the man just doesn't stop, and he's on his 5th marriage now, I think.
He doesn't stop there either.
Yep. So that was also an appeal for sure, because he's such an eccentric person off screen as well. I'm a big fan of the city of New Orleans, and he's got, like his future burial place there. He used to, like, he had bought the Lalaurie mansion at one point in time. So he's just kind of an oddball, and we were really interested in just like researching, like, we would have like a Nick Cage fact every episode. Yeah, we would have like a fact. We would just trade off, and we talked about his, like, he bought a shark at one point in time. He owned an octopus.
Yeah.
There's no shortage of material for sure.
Yeah. But on the advocacy plus aggressiveness and cursing and that sort of thing, is that we are just kind of loud, aggressive people. Specifically, I am pretty loud, aggressive, and historically advocacy hasn't been a quiet thing, and there's really, room for advocacy of every flavor, right? So for us to be saying, what's the deal with this bullshit? Why has X company done whatever with their audio description, or why suddenly has this company, updated their app and now it's no longer accessible? That sort of stuff is a kind of a more natural way for us to approach advocacy. And we know that there are tons of folks out there who are looking for advocacy that isn't so sterile, I guess. What's the word I'm looking for?
Not so like docile,
clean cut. Yeah. So there are people that want to scream out into the world, and we want to do that for them to whatever degree.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, Jordan is for sure loud and aggressive in his own right, but I've also been known to be loud and aggressive just throughout my life with, I mean, it's mostly been like queer and people of color advocacy work that I've done in the past. So this was just kind of another thing to advocate for. And I think it's just who we are as people. We're just like, we don't want to treat people with kid gloves. Like, it's a very real experience that people are living, and the people who are blind and visually impaired are all ages. They're not all like children. And I mean, some people are growing up blind. Some people like Jordan experience it later on in life. And it's not a clean cut process, and it's not, something that like, and it's hard when people live in a world that I've heard Jordan say over and over again, like, this world isn't made for me. And it's hard as a human and hard as a partner to hear your partner say, like, this world isn't made for me. And I hate that. Like, I just want to be able to like sit down and like watch the same things and like have Jordan have as much enjoyment out of it as I do. And so, I mean, it was just very natural for me to like want to be loud and obnoxious and advocate as well.
It's so cool, everything that you're saying here, like the stereotypes, those assumptions, like you said, with kid gloves. Ashley, you talked about intersectionality of different
Definitely,
other sides in the spectrum. That I'm thinking about, like, instead of stereotype, it's sterile type. That you're breaking the sterile type, and it's like, you've made a podcast for you now. It's like. So I have to ask, Jordan, what is the MacGuffin? Is it Nick Cage? Is it audio description? Or is it blind advocacy? Like, what's the hook that really isn't the hook? It sounds like, the core of what you and Ashley are doing is to make something for you, whatever that means, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And it was never going to be like a singular podcast. And the way that we advocate and the way that we live is never going to be singular. So we just felt like
we're definitely not traditional human beings.
Yes, we felt like we would just, encompass everything and just throw it out there. And if people, enjoy it, and I think that there is a kind of barrier in podcasting in general, where you have all these niche podcasts like ours, or like take a gardening or a woodworking podcast, for example, that all have this real potential to grab an audience that doesn't really give a shit about the key subject matter, where it then kind of steps past that into a podcast about the people that are hosting it to a degree. And that's the appeal we're looking for. And I think the main grab would be to get our hands on folks who have no idea what audio description is. So
that's definitely something that we have heard from a lot of folks.
Yeah.
And I mean, to be honest, I had never heard of audio description before meeting Jordan either. Right. And so, I mean, as annoying as it is, to like have a podcast and like have your friends be like, hey, check out my podcast. It's not like a multi-level marketing. It's just like, hey, check out like the hour a week that I bullshit with my boyfriend about the fact that like he can't watch movies the way that you can watch movies. And that's really important to people.
Right.
Was the response from your audience what you expected? Like, were you expecting some sort of response and you got something different, or was it the same?
I expected openness, and I think that's what we've had so far. We have had a couple of people suggest that we perhaps tone down the cursing a bit.
Why the fuck would they do that?
I think it is just it's probably just the general understanding of it not being appealing to everyone, but also a lack of cursing isn't necessarily appealing to everyone either. So whichever side we end up on, we're going to lose some appeal. So,
yeah. And I think also we definitely have had feedback like, hey, maybe not so aggressive, like you get more. Was it you get more flies with
catch more flies with honey?
Yeah. But like, I'm I hate honey, first of all. And I eat vinegar so much more than I eat honey. Just on a personal note. But like, I'm tired of honey. Like, and I get that. And I mean, we've been seeing it, especially, you know, hearkening back to last summer with the Black Lives Matter movement being reignited. And not that it ever went away. But I mean, when is it going to be enough? Like, how nice do people have to be who are disabled, who are people of color, who are queer, who are marginalized in some way? How nice do they have to be before they get what they need? And I know that even within the communities, there's so much infighting within the communities that, you know, like, oh, audio description, like, it sucks when it's, you know, speech to text, but, you know, like, well, you're more privileged than most blind people with audio description, so you should just take what you can get. Well, no, like, I want quality audio description. Like, why do I not get the same amount? Do I not get the same quality that other people do? And it goes back to, you know, like, why isn't this system built for me? Why isn't this world built for me? That a lot of marginalized folks feel. So like, when are we going to have to like stop being nice? And I think that that's just our thing, is that like, we didn't start by being nice. And there's definitely, I think, a level of understanding, because we do have people who ask questions, and it's not like we're like, oh, you know, that's such a silly question. We greet every question as graciously as humanly possible. And by we, I mean Jordan, because they're definitely
most of the questions are, hey,
directed at Jordan.
What's the deal with this blind thing?
Yeah.
Which,
and we welcome that kind of stuff, because we do want to educate people. So it's not all about being totally aggressive and being in people's faces, but at some point in time, like, it has to be. And that's okay. And I think that sometimes people just have to realize that, like, yes, people are learning. So if people ask us questions or ask Jordan questions, we're not going to like respond aggressively. But if you tell us to be quiet, or tell us that, you know, our anger turns people away, well, then maybe maybe on one hand, those aren't the people who are going to listen anyway. And maybe on the other hand, those are the people who need to just like see past themselves and listen.
Jordan, what was one of your favorite responses to one of those questions that came in your engagement with the audience? You know, obviously there's got to be some barriers from the audience's perspective that, you know, you may choose to break down, or maybe it's just not worth it for you, or maybe it's something else. Like, what's one of your favorite responses? Was it just like no comment, or was there some sort of engagement that you're really proud of how you responded, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, I'm trying to think of some of the questions we've had. Even just
totally putting you on the spot here.
No, you're fine. Some of the questions, like even a recent question was one that I was pretty pleased with, and it was more just a general blindness question than an audio description question. But it was, do you feel like you have some sort of advantage because you have experience, you know, living a good chunk of your life as a sighted person? Do you have some sort of advantage knowing, you know, what certain colors are, what certain things look like, and just kind of having that in your memory bank? And I could have given the light answer of, yeah, certainly, and kind of just moved on with it. But the real answer is yes and no, because the reality is that a blind person who's been learning Braille since the age of 3 has a massive advantage in terms of their Braille literacy over, you know, a 26-year-old man trying to start picking it up. So I think that the big part that I've just been very pleased with is being able to answer everyone's questions with full honesty, rather than like we were saying before, the kid gloves. You know, people deserve honest answers to their questions, and I'm happy that I've been able to give them for the most part.
Yeah. And that authenticity, it sounds like, you know, specifically in that example of the advantage of maybe someone who was born blind learning skills earlier than you learning the new skills versus, you know, growing into it. It's like those kinds of nuanced questions, I think, kind of goes back to what Ashley was implying when it comes to the audio description quality and quantity, that there is this nuanced perspective that's not like this Sophie's choice of you can either have more audio description or you can have it better. It sounds like that kind of engagement that kind of conversation is possible to have simply because of the way that you approach your podcast with this take off the kid gloves. Like, this is a hard conversation.
Oh.
Is that right, Ashley?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and there's also a part of me as a sighted person who you can advocate for people, but you also have to make sure that you're not like you're not trying to like victimize yourself in any way. By saying like, oh, that classic, like, oh, well, I know because, I have a friend who is X. That's totally fine. Absolutely advocate for people. But also like, don't make yourself a victim in the meantime, and don't get angry on behalf. Like, don't make it about you. Like, that's what I try to keep in mind, is that I can get angry about things like the argument that happened within the blind and visually impaired community, because I'm on some of those pages as well. And Roy, I'm sure you know better than most that being on the internet and being in a community on the internet is quite a blast these days, and like moderating groups and things like that. So you can see those kinds of fights, and then you can see like the generational differences too. So, we have those stereotypes that we have to fight against as millennials, because, we have the people who are older who are like, oh, like millennials have like XYZ in terms of advocacy, and, we never had that kind of stuff. And it's like, well, why are millennials the enemy when we're just trying to advocate for the things that we need, and for the people who are younger than us, and for the people who are older than us? Like, I don't understand like why we have to fight against one another when it comes to advocacy. So, people talking about how privileged, millennial and Generation Z, like blind and visually impaired folks are, because they're so entitled, and they have like all these things that like the older generations never had. And it's frustrating to see that, but I also need to know that I need to stay in my lane, that I, as a sighted person, do not need to get involved in those kinds of conversations. And rather, I would talk to Jordan about that kind of stuff, because I, fully, it's easy for me intersectional wise, like as a queer Latina woman, to voice those kinds of things. But when it comes to being a marginalized person where I don't have those, so like I'm not blind, I'm not visually impaired. So I think that it's important to remember for us, like when we're advocating, that like we definitely need to stay in our lanes when it's necessary, and to amplify the voices of blind and visually impaired folks in those kinds of struggles, when it's either, like I've mentioned before, like the infighting, or just advocating to the world in general.
It's a great example, Ashley. And I love how that kind of parallels my experience in audio description as a voice talent, because I don't mean to make this about me, but I think there's a parallel in that I found that once I listened to the audiences, and also the training as a voice talent, my focus is on the story. If anyone's paying attention to me as a voice talent in the audio description, I'm not doing the work. I'm not serving the work. I'm not helping the story being told. My goal is to make sure the story's being told, not, hey, how great my voice is. And so I might be stretching here.
Listen to me.
Yeah, exactly. And so that kind of perspective from your side. And Jordan, going back, you had said, oh, do you still have that? What was your oh?
Oh.
Yeah.
I remember when Jordan was answering that question specifically, I was there about the like having the advantage. And he had said specifically, like, the challenges that you face as a 26-year-old versus, being 3 and learning things from when you're already at this age where like your brain is supposed to be absorbing all these things. Right. And like they say, like, it's so much easier for like kids to understand like different languages and things like that at that age, but they're also not like paying bills and afraid of like missing work and that kind of stuff as a 26-year-old, having a mortgage and stuff, that like you can't just take time off. Like not everyone can. Some people can, to just take time off to like go to a center.
Yeah. So to give you some perspective on that, I started losing my sight. I think it was exactly 6 months plus a couple of days after I closed on my first house. So it wasn't just, oh shucks, let's get all the training I need to get me up to speed. It's, oh shucks, I've got to keep paying my mortgage while getting all the training I need. So the reality of being an adult while learning anything is that you've got all these other responsibilities dumped on top of you, and you're trying to figure out, life. Whereas when you're 3 years old, I think other people are paying your bills and buying your food.
Hopefully.
So, but yeah, I can't remember. It was probably another question I was thinking of in general. I mean, as far as just weird questions and times I've been fairly pleased with my answers, one of the best in it. I haven't been asked this question for a while, but has sex changed at all since I lost my sight? And my answer was that I didn't really have sex with the lights on that often in the past anyway. But I don't know. People don't really ask the weird questions.
What does that have to do with Angelina Jolie's bad hair in car films? Does that correlate to your sex life at all, or is that a separate subject?
It's completely separate. No, that hair is really that's one thing that I pretty distinctly remember, is that hair has no bearing on any of that.
I was afraid I was about to learn something new about him just now.
Oh God.
And that did not happen. So I think we're all kind of lucky.
Yeah,
that's brilliant. But that kind of invasive question, though, I think pivots to the lack of understanding, or as Ashley had said, staying in the lane. That's your choice to volunteer and share that information on your terms.
Yeah.
That kind of conversation outside of, I just met somebody on this intersection. What's your sex life like being blind? That kind of thing has got to happen, and it's got to get old.
Yeah. And I mean, it's honestly, it's something that we say kind of on the show randomly when stuff like that comes up, is treat people like people and you'll be fine. And
wow. Yeah.
It's
a weird concept.
It's, such a strange thing to have to say ever, but it's extremely uncommon, and I think probably has never happened where I meet someone and within the first 4 minutes ask them about their sex life. So the idea that someone's disability or race or gender or sexuality entitles you to any more of their highly personal information needs to kind of go away, because it's really definitely a weird thing that folks like to do.
Yeah. And what a great template. Treat people like people. And that's
easy. You're good to go.
Seems pretty good. Let's wrap this up by asking if there's anything else that you'd like to share, whether it's about Site Attendant, your podcast, anything. Let me start with you, Ashley, if I could put you on the spot. What's something that you'd like to share with our audience?
Well, I talked to Jordan about this, so I don't know if I'm allowed to say this or not, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway, because I'm an independent woman and I don't need you.
I was going to say, I think I know where you're going.
No, we actually, so you said earlier that we could kind of talk about behind the scenes Site Attendants. So we just put together some plans for our new season. So to kind of give you some context and build up a little bit of suspense, when we were doing the Nick Cage stuff, we found that so many of his movies are so bad. They're freaking garbage. It's, ugh. I had such a shit time watching some of these films that the podcast wasn't fun to do anymore. It would be we watched this other shitty movie and it was terrible, and this is why it was terrible.
Yeah. Go watch Mom and Dad.
Oh my God.
It's the most terrible Nick Cage film, but
oh my God. And we have so many more to watch. I could not imagine. Our original idea was to watch all 104 films, and I'm so glad we abandoned that, because my God, I don't know if my sanity would have allowed it. So then our second season, we decided to focus on blind representation in TV and films. And that's been a lot of fun, because there are a lot of different options for us, and there are a lot of trash options, which also kind of suck, but it keeps it interesting. So in line with the podcast also being about our interests, we have decided that we would like to do an entire season on Stephen King. and audio description. We're really big Stephen King, just like super nerds with like reading his stuff, and I mean like watching some of his stuff because there's so many adaptations that are just awful. So we want to do a season on Stephen King and like blind characters that he's done, blind storylines. And actually, so you served as a kind of like an additional piece of that because you did the audio description for one of the seasons of Castle Rock, I think. And so that kind of like that also like contributed to it. So, you know, the roles might be reversed in the future here.
Very exciting.
For our season on Stephen King stuff. And we had talking about that on this to let our listeners know to come and listen to this episode, because we're not going to be talking about it on our podcast. We're going to say, hey, we have a special announcement, but you have to go and listen to this other amazing podcast to hear it. So
very clever. I love it. It's a crossover episode.
Yeah.
Nicely done, Jordan. I like it. Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, and it's like, I'm very excited to hear what you have to say, because that whole team on any audio description project, at least the ones that I'm involved with, I don't do any of the writing. I just read the script. And so those writers really take, you know, the good quality writers really recognize the value of the audio description and that immersion that really lends to that experience and parody to sighted audiences. So I'm very excited to hear where the whole Stephen King season goes with you both.
Yeah, we are both pretty heavy avid Stephen King readers, so we're excited to dive into some of the like over 50 films and shows that have been adapted.
It's
get
going to
your
be
season
quite a
coming out
time.
for you. What about you,
We'll
Jordan?
see.
Anything else you'd like to add?
No, I mean, I guess just kind of to tag onto what you were just talking about is that this podcast has made me realize the incredible amount of work that goes into creating just a piece of audio. So to the folks that consume the podcasts or specifically audio description stuff, just say thanks. If you ever interact with a QA tech, a engineer, a narrator, a writer, any of those folks, just hit them with a thank you, because it's pretty incredible work that's being done. And it seems like there's just more and more of it every day. I mean, with the HBO stuff dropping within the last handful of days. I don't know. Do you date your shows? Does that date this one?
I'm usually pretty monogamous, and I've been in for the last year. It's funny. There's some shows that I do, and
I guess that'll date this one a little bit. Folks will know when HBO dropped their audio description. So if this doesn't release for another month or two, but
let's say that we're recording this the end of March.
Yeah. So with that sort of thing is that it seems like companies are really piling it on nowadays, and it's a lot of work for your audio description talent, which is all inclusive. I think I've seen you write before about like the 11 parts of audio description
that was thrown together. It was just it was like 18, and it's like any single one of them can be the weakest link.
Army of people, So tell them thanks if you ever interact with them.
Very nice. And one more time, we've got the Site Attendant podcast, and our special guests are Jordan Cole and Ashley Bushner. Anything else that you'd like to share with our audience?
No, I think I'm good. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. We thank you for having us on.
Yeah,
it's been really awesome.
Oh, this is great. Thank you so much for joining.
Of course.
Yeah, thanks.